Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, where we're going to introduce our strategic scenarios and also outline some structure and methodologies that companies can use to create their own scenarios and help them think about an increasingly uncertain future. My name's Andy Houston. I'm a director at AFRY Management Consulting in the UK. Next slide, please. So as a quick disclaimer here, which I invite everybody to read at their leisure, the pack will be available afterwards. For now, next slide, please, Gabriela. So in addition to myself, I'm joined by Ingolf Dorn and Gabriela Vargas Restrepo, who work in our strategy service line, both in the UK business and who have led the production of these scenarios. So they will they'll be doing most of the talking today. Next slide, please. So just a couple of admin points. If you want to ask any questions, there should be a box on your GoToWebinar panel to type in questions. We'll cover as many as we can at the end. And the slide pack, as I said, and the recording of the webinar will be made available on our website afterwards. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Ingolf to take us through the scenarios.
Yeah, hello everyone, and delighted to meet you and to present today's webinar to you, which is structured in 3 sections. So I will kick off by introducing our strategic scenarios, which has been a pleasure to develop over the last half year or so. It was really great exercise working across our office networks, taking different perspectives into account and really making this a shared effort across the team of coming up with these scenarios. Then Gabriela will talk you through the methodology and approach that we've used to creating these scenarios, which you can then also use maybe working with us to create your own scenarios. And I'll conclude by reiterating the importance of developing strategic scenarios for you. Next slide, please. So kind of stating the obvious, as you are all aware, there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the future, and no one of us has that kind of magic crystal ball to see what the future will bring. This makes decision-making very difficult, which is particularly true for energy companies who typically make long-term decisions in investments, for which they often only know whether the right decision has been made, say 20, 10 or 5 years down the line. So they need a lot of foresight and understanding of those megatrends and of their business environment in which they operate. There are a number of megatrends that impact the environment in which energy companies operate, and it's really essential for energy companies to understand these. However, the signals are not always clear. There tends to be a lot of noise, a lot of misleading information, or information going in one direction and more information going in another direction. So for example, if you look at this slide and if you generally consult the media, on a daily basis, you'll see these dramatic headlines providing us with a sensationalist view of how these trends will impact us, with the only constant here being that the impact is being sold to us as being 100% certain and negative. As a result, we're looking at a picture of the future that is all doom and gloom, that feels quite negative. It's something to be afraid of almost. You don't want to go into the future because it's all looking very gloomy. That is not to say that there isn't opportunity in chaos. For example, while households and businesses suffer, oil and gas majors have made windfall profits on the back of high commodity prices that we've seen over the last year or so. Then on the other hand, if you listen to people like, say, Steven Pinker, Barack Obama, or if you've read Factfulness by Hans Rosling, which is a book a lot of people in our company have read, you know that we currently live in what they call the best time in human history. There has been a lot of progress on mortality, on longevity, on the eradication of major diseases, on improving literacy, on raising living standards, and so on over the last century. Furthermore, if we then engage with scientists and technology experts to look at the future, we are likely to receive the opposite view of the future, or the opposite perspective to the media. We get a very techno-optimistic outlook with solutions for all of the problems the world faces. As a result, we're looking at a very positive or even utopian view of the future. So very, very empowering. You just want to act, you want to get out there because the future is looking great. However, when you realize that there's both of these perspectives, what remains is that these perspectives are miles apart and irreconcilable in a consistent view of the future. So this high level of uncertainty of what the future may actually look like remains. and you realize that there's a broad range of potential future pathways that are all more or less equally valid, some of them more negative, some of them more positive. Next slide, please. This kind of realization doesn't help companies. You still need to make decisions in the short term that affect how you fare in the mid to long term. As this funnel chart illustration shows, uncertainty around how trends may develop and impact companies increases over time. You can see that by the widening of this funnel over time. We may have a very good understanding of what happens at the start of this funnel, so in the next, say, 2 weeks, 2 months or so. But if you look at 2050 or beyond, uncertainty increases, the funnel widens, you can't be sure of what's happening. So coming then to the second best option for companies in the absence of that magic crystal ball, and that is to prepare for a range of possible outcomes for the future. We believe the best tool for doing so is for energy companies to develop their strategic thinking through scenario-driven strategic analysis. By identifying the levers that shape the environment in which a company operates, and by creating scenarios of the future that cover multiple potential pathways that are all valid, companies can develop strategies that are more flexible and flexible enough to be prepared for a wider set of future changes or future outcomes. Now, you may say that, we've tried to do this, but it's quite costly. It needs a lot of people. We would need to hire, we need a lot of different perspectives, people with different skill sets, different views of how these things may evolve in the future that have a perspective from all different sorts of angles. And that is where we come in at AFRY Management Consulting. Next slide, please. We have gone through an exercise of identifying and creating what we see as 4 of the most relevant potential scenarios of the future. These scenarios are plausible but not exhaustive, as there are endless possibilities, as I said before. They are designed to ensure companies think of themselves in different and sometimes very uncomfortable situations so that you are prepared for these situations. Our scenarios are what-if type scenarios that provide an outlook to 2050 and beyond. The main scenario narrative is set around different ways to react to climate change. Each of our scenarios gives a different answer to the question of how the world may react to climate change. During today's webinar, I will only provide you with the headline scenario narratives in this slide and highlight some of the key differences between them in the next slide. Some of you might be aware, we've published actually quite a nice brochure on these scenarios on our website, and that brochure takes you on a journey through time in each scenario in more detail with reference to the key scenario levers that we will show you on the next slide. All scenarios have one thing in common. They start from today's status quo, which is characterized by the world being on the brink of recession with high costs of living and high inflation. Cooperation between governments is being tested by the Russia-Ukraine war. Over the last few years, we've seen multiple heat waves during the summer that have led to countries such as the UK experiencing extreme temperatures and drought. And as we all know, this has been even worse in other parts of the world. Remember the forest fires in California, remember the forest fires in Australia, remember the flooding in Bangladesh. So a lot of calamities with the source being climate change. Other consequences include the forced displacement of an average of 20 million people a year from their homes due to, on the one hand, climate change, and on the other hand, regional conflicts, which in part may be due to the impacts of climate change, such as the lack of availability of water or the lack of availability of farmable land as a consequence of climate change. On the more positive side, technological progress is proceeding at pace, and consumers have become more conscious of the impact of their decisions. The diversification of the energy mix, especially in Europe, has taken large strides. Renewables now make up a larger share in the energy mix, and this growth trend continues globally. So we see lots of companies across the globe catching up with Europe, trying to build out their renewable fleets as well. So really positive change here. Amongst others, we've seen the EU and parts of the US introduce meaningful carbon pricing, another incentive to kind of decarbonize and to create the revenues that are needed for more renewable deployment. The question is then, where does the world go from here? And that's exactly the question our 4 scenarios answer, but all in different ways. As said, we are trying to prepare for potential outcomes, for different outcomes. So we want to have a wide range of potential futures to think about and see how companies fare in these different futures, to prepare them for those futures and to enable them to make the right decisions. In the first scenario, governments are the leading agents driving the actions needed to mitigate climate change. Governments realized that direct intervention and a return to closer global cooperation is needed. International political cooperation becomes a priority, and global governments work together to define binding global emissions reduction targets with supporting policies such as global carbon pricing that lead to achieving global net zero by 2050. This cooperation in the climate space rebuilds international trust, and that leads to cooperation in other sectors as well, in other areas as well. So including global policy steering consumer behavior, measures protecting biodiversity and forests, and so on. But most importantly, what we see is economic cooperation, which leads to a return of global growth with a clear recognition that developing countries need to be brought along that journey to avoid conflict and unorderly migration. So here really the world is coming together and working together to create a better future. The other realization is in this scenario, and that's what governments are working towards, is that this growth needs to be focused in the clean energy and circular economies. Moving on to the second scenario, here it's the business community that takes charge, and via technological innovations and advancements supported by a flourishing academic sector, drives carbon emission reductions and economic growth. In this view of the future, governments cooperate to support technology development and supply chains, but they fail to set global emission reduction targets. So it's really just economic action, businesses getting active, which gets us onto this decarbonization trajectory, which drives the deployment of clean technologies and which helps the world in this scenario achieve net zero, but slightly later than in the first scenario. So in this scenario, we reach net zero by 2060. In the third scenario, the push for climate change mitigation is bottom up. There's governmental inaction, and that leads to continued regional conflicts, economic hardship, and accelerated climate change. As a result, societies really get fed up with this and the pressure starts to mount. Especially in the Western world and liberal nations, where it is safe for civil societies, NGOs, and other grassroots movements to do so, these kinds of organizations start to push governments and corporates to act. This approach to mitigating climate change is the least successful of the three scenarios in which the response to climate change is mitigation. Global net zero is only achieved by 2080, so 30 years later than in scenario 1 and 20 years later than in scenario 2. This scenario is also the most challenging in many other areas, with high levels of unorderly migration, low economic growth, and little innovation. It's the one I would like to live in the least, so I'm really not up for scenario 3. But as I said earlier, it's these types of more extreme cases that really help companies think about and plan for possible futures and take those actions that protect them from scenarios or from the impacts that we see in scenarios like this one. The fourth scenario is then very different. Here, this scenario is one of adaptation rather than mitigation. Mainstream thinking really makes a major shift, and climate change is accepted as a reality. Successful adaptation becomes the objective of international cooperation between governments. Economies focus on growth and continue with business as usual. Driven by the pressure created by the need to adapt to climate change, however, new industries emerge that develop adaptation technologies, which further drives economic growth and opportunity. Unlike in the other three scenarios, net zero won't be achieved. But due to successful adaptation, this is not the end of the world. With the exception of some of the negative consequences of climate change, such as loss of biodiversity, loss of land for agricultural use, and loss of a large share of the world's forests, this actually feels like quite a positive scenario for humanity and for energy companies, if you think about it. Next slide, please. This slide provides an at-a-glance overview of how we've defined our scenarios, and Gabriela will talk about the process for developing our scenarios shortly. But just to say that here you can see the positioning of each of the scenarios for each of the 9 scenario levers that we've used to define the scenarios. And I don't really want to take too much away from Gabriela, but as you can see here, we have 6 global trends economic growth, cooperation between governments, breakthrough technologies, consumer behavior, carbon emissions and climate change, and migration, which are global trends and which the energy sector or players in the energy sector can't really impact. So they're too broad and not controllable. Then we have energy sector specific drivers, energy prices, energy mix diversification, carbon policies, where through action or through lobbying, energy companies can have an impact. Let's draw out some of the key similarities and differences between our four scenarios. We look at carbon emissions and governmental cooperation in the next slide, but when it comes to the remaining four global trends, we see that we have three scenarios with relatively high economic growth. Scenario 3, which is the society-led mitigation, is here the exception due to the combination of negative consequences of climate change, a deeper recession in the short to midterm, and higher levels of regional conflicts. Then moving on to breakthrough technologies, these are most widely developed in scenario 2 and scenario 4, but from a different angle here. Right? In scenario 2, they are used for mitigation, and technological progress focuses on developing new renewable and clean technologies and on making improvements to existing ones. Hydrogen is deployed at scale, supported by improved storage technologies, and the heat and transport sectors are decarbonized at pace. Negative emissions technologies are developed and the circular economy takes off via the development of bioplastics and biofuels. Now looking at technological development in scenario 4, here new technologies are developed for adaptation rather than for mitigation. Innovations include technologies for protecting building stock against extreme weather, infrastructure to protect against floods, cooling and sun protection technologies, water purification and recycling technologies, agricultural technologies to make unarable land arable or to be more efficient at farming land, and then disease control technologies and so on. So really technologies that help the world adapt to this new reality of climate change or persistent climate change due to the lack of mitigation. The extremes for changes in consumer behavior are scenario 3, where change is consumer-led, as I said before, and scenario 4, where we get back into a consumer paradise type of mindset. People continue to buy, consume, travel. So that might remind you of a world before COVID that then continues out into the future. So lots of consumerism, lots of spending, lots of economic activity that leads to more carbon emissions in this world because we are adapting to climate change rather than mitigating climate change and reducing emissions. If we then look at the three energy sector specific drivers, we see some differentiation between scenarios 1 and 2, where these have the lowest energy prices due to high renewable penetration and newer clean technologies being more efficient than legacy ones, and scenario 4, which has the highest energy prices due to continued use of fossil fuels, with extraction of these becoming more expensive over time as more difficult to develop, unconventional fields need to be explored to kind of drive that economic boom and drive consumerism. The energy mix is most diversified in scenario 1 and least diversified in scenario 4, and that is due to high continued reliance on gas and coal-fired power stations and the use of oil in the transport sector. The shift towards hydrogen does not happen in scenario 4, and unconventional oil and gas resources are still being discovered. However, peak oil before 2100 is on the horizon, so adaptation to this new reality will also be required, but beyond the horizon that we've kind of focused on, or beyond the time horizon we focused on in the development of our four scenarios. With regards to the implementation of formal emissions reduction policies, so carbon policies and measures such as carbon pricing, the extreme points are scenario 1 with very strict global legislation developed by global governments, and scenario 4 where we see an absolute absence, no policies and measures at all, and even a repeal of existing policies and targets in the realm of climate change, in the realm of reducing emissions. So very different worlds. Coming on to the next slide. So I think the previous slide showed quite a complex picture. To simplify this, we can just look at the scenario definition in the two core narrative dimensions only. This slide differentiates the scenarios in terms of their carbon emission intensity and the level of cooperation between global governments, either in mitigating or, as in the case of scenario 4, in adapting to climate change. So this is quite a nice graphic where you can actually see how these scenarios look different in those two dimensions. If we move on to the next slide. The final slide of this section then shows how our 4 scenarios do in terms of achieving global net zero by 2050. So you can see the carbon emission intensity, the carbon emissions over time. Again, the extremes here are scenario 1, where government-led mitigation leads to successful achievement of net zero by 2050, and scenario 4, where you have extreme adaptation, where carbon emissions continue to rise as the use of fossil fuels in the global economy intensifies. And then scenarios 2 and 3 sit between 1 and 4. Just to say that these are illustrative pathways of emissions reductions. They're not fundamentally modeled or aligned with milestones set by either regional or national policies. I hope you found this insight into our scenarios interesting, and it's given you a bit of an understanding what goes on in these 4 very different worlds. As said, more information on these in the brochure we've published. And now I'm handing over to Gabriela to take you through how we've actually come up, how we've developed these strategic scenarios.
Perfect. Thank you, Ingolf. And now that we have a clear sense of what AFRY scenarios are, I want to talk about what was the process that we followed to create those scenarios, and how can we ensure that they're not only strong and dependable, but that they're also consistent. So we recommend these 4 steps, this 4-step process to create scenarios. The first step is define. And define is all about parameters. It's about framing, it's about creating a frame so that scenarios are consistent all along the process. So the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves, what is the problem that we intend to solve with the scenarios? When we have that problem identified, we go on to ask, what is the time frame that we want to use? Is it more long-term or is it more short-term? What is the region or the geography that our scenarios are going to be set in? And if there are any other relevant factors that we need to take into account when shaping those scenarios. Once we have that frame identified and clear, we can move into the second step, which is design. And in the design stage, what we do is we map all those uncertainties and all those factors that could have an impact on the company, and understand which of them are the critical levers that we need to monitor in the future. With those, we can make some key assumptions about the future of the company and move on to the third step, which is analyze. In the analyze step, we take the levers that we've chosen and understand what is the relationship between those variables, what is the interaction between them. So is it a direct or indirect relationship, or is it a weak or strong interaction? With that, we can create the structure of the narratives. As you saw Ingolf just explain, we have a clear structure of what each narrative is telling us, and what that world means. And then we can understand what is the risks and what are the opportunities that arise from each of those narratives. And lastly, we can understand also what is the impact on the relevant stakeholders, on the company's relevant stakeholders regarding each of the scenarios. With all that information, a company has now the option to think what are the strategies that they need to implement in order to navigate each of the scenarios. So I'm going to go into each of the steps in a little bit more detail. The first step, as I was saying, is define. The first thing, and it begins with the problem. So what is the problem that we intend to solve? This will become the backbone of the narratives and the backbone of the structure. Ingolf just said before that in the case of AFRY scenarios, we chose how will the world react to climate change? How will we reduce carbon emissions? So that became carbon emissions, and climate change became our backbone. And once we had that problem set, we could move on. So the second part of the define step is, will the time frame be long-term or short-term? Will scenarios be set in 5 years? Will they be set in 10 years, 25, 50, etc.? Where will the scenarios be set? Will they be in a city, in a country? Will they be global? Or are there any other components that are important for us to take into account when shaping the scenarios? Is it because we want to highlight a specific business unit, or is it that the nature of the business itself has needs a special treatment when we are structuring the scenarios? it is very important to note here that each company will have different parameters according to its needs. So for example, a tech company will probably need scenarios that are not as long, in term, but more short term. Because the industry moves so quickly, it won't be worth looking so far ahead, but they will need to take into account what would happen in maybe 10 or 15 years. So every company will have different parameters, but the important thing is that they are framed from the beginning so that the scenarios are dependable and consistent in the long run. So once that is defined, when we have the frame set, we can move on to the design step. And it's in this step, in the design step, that we need to take into account that every company performs in an external environment. That external environment has factors, trends, drivers that are not in the company's control, but that affect the way it performs in that environment. So we divided the competitive environment into two levels. The first are the global trends, and the second are the sector-specific drivers. You already saw a little bit of this when Ingolf was explaining it, but the global trends are all those factors that are not in the company's control, but will affect the way it performs, regardless of the industry it belongs to or even where the geography they're located in. So examples of global trends are such as geopolitical stability, or the pandemic is a really good example of global trends, which is a factor that affected companies regardless of the industry they were in or even the geography in which they were located. The sector-specific drivers are also external in the sense that companies do not have control over them, but affect mainly companies of the industry. So if we're talking about oil and gas companies as an example, a sector-specific driver could be activism or new regulations being introduced. The company will need to respond because it affects the way it behaves and it performs, but they are uncertain in a way. So the first part of this design step is to map out all those different factors that represent an uncertainty to the company. To do so, we use the STEEP analysis. This STEEP analysis is a framework that allows us to categorize all those factors and uncertainties into 5 different categories: social, technological, environmental, economic, and political. And here we brought the example of AFRY's scenarios and how we did it. This is the map of the global trends and the sector-specific drivers divided in the 5 STEEP groups. And as you can see, the use of this is to be able to have a clear and broad overview of the external environment of the company. This allows us to understand what are all those different uncertainties that a company could face, and then decide which of them are the most critical ones. So as you can see here, this is also the AFRY's example. We chose levers that we have to choose the levers that are most critical to the company, which are those that we need to monitor in the future. Of course, the STEEP analysis is beneficial because it allows us to see the environment in its whole. So we chose an economic driver, a political driver, a technological driver, social, and environmental. In this way, we know that we are monitoring every aspect of the environment, of the competitive environment, but also we know that these are the most critical ones for the specific company. So once we have chosen the critical levers and the variables, we can move on to the third step, which is analyze. And in order to, and as you saw when Ingolf showed the slide with the different levers, what makes scenarios consistent is that each lever means the same for everyone. So what we need to do here in the analyze step is define what it means when a lever decreases and when a lever increases. We brought the example of the carbon emissions and climate change lever because, as you know, is the structure of our scenarios. And we defined it as carbon emissions and climate change decreases means that we manage to reach net zero and limit the increase of the planet's temperature to 1.5 degrees. That means also that there is less natural disasters, there will be less health concerns related to climate change, and there will be less biodiversity loss. If the carbon emissions and climate change lever increases, on the other hand, then that means that carbon emissions will increase, that the temperature of the planet will consistently rise by more than 3 degrees, and therefore there will be more natural disasters, more health concerns, and more biodiversity loss. So as I was saying, it's really important in this step to have a clear understanding of what each of the levers means, what it means if it goes up and what it means if it goes down. And with that, the next step is understanding what is the relationship and the interaction between those variables. So continuing with the example of the carbon emissions and climate change, what happens if it increases, for example, to the migration lever? We've established that if carbon emissions increase, then there will be more natural disasters. So probably migration will increase too. It's very important to understand those different relationships and interactions, because in the next part of the analyze step, we have to start structuring the narrative of the scenarios. And here, when we are structuring those narratives, we have to play around with the levers to create the possible outcomes. So this slide should be a little bit familiar with what Ingolf was saying, but what we need to create are all those possible futures that the company could face. They don't need to be probable, but they need to be possible. So there are many ways of doing it. We could have 3 scenarios in which one is a positive scenario, one is the neutral scenario, and one is the negative scenario. Or the company could decide to do it any other way. We as AFRY chose the carbon emissions and climate change lever, and we decided to understand who was the main actor. So as you already know, in the scenario 1, government was the main actor in the mitigation of carbon emissions and climate change. In the second scenario, technology was the main actor. In the third scenario, consumers and society was the main actor. And then we had a fourth scenario with no mitigation at all. But the important thing here is that once we have created those structures and we have a clear sense of what the narrative of each scenario is, the company can start assessing what are the risks and what are the opportunities in each of those scenarios. So in scenario 1, we will have this and this opportunity, and in scenario 1, we will have this and this risks. So what that allows is for companies to move to the fourth step, which is strategize. With leveraging those risks and opportunities from each of the scenarios, companies can start making long-term and short-term decisions, strategic decisions. So in the long term, we can start looking at the broad strategy. What is the mission and what is the vision of a company? Where do we want to be? Where do we want to be, and in what time frame? What do we need to do in order to reach that position? And in the short term, scenarios can also help companies ask really tough questions. For example, how do we plan demand and supply? In what should we invest or disinvest? How do we react or how do we adapt to new regulation being introduced? What technologies should we look for in order to achieve our strategy? And here, what we do in the strategy is take all those possible outcomes and create strategies that will help us not only survive in difficult environments, but also thrive. So I want to move, and this last slide of this segment of the webinar is to show you how different types of companies will be more or less affected by each scenario, and the importance of using and strategizing, and what is the importance of strategizing. So we brought here examples. This is not exhaustive, this is just illustrative. But if we were to take an oil and gas company, the risks they present in scenario 1 are much higher than in scenario 4, for example. So oil and gas companies in scenario 1 will face a lot of government intervention, a lot of new regulation, and therefore they will face a lot of obstacles when they're trying to explore, for example. In scenario 4, on the other hand, they won't have social pressure, they won't have government regulation, and they will be able to develop new technologies and become more efficient when they are doing their business as usual. They will be able to explore a lot more, and they will become much more efficient in their business as usual. On the other hand, if we take renewable developers, for example, in scenario 1, they are being incentivized by governments who are issuing new regulation, and therefore they will be able to develop new technologies and become much more efficient in developing. And in scenario 4, for example, without that government intervention and having to compete against oil and gas companies as well, that are now much more efficient, they will face a lot more obstacles. So the key takeaway we wanna give you in this segment is that strategy is dependent on the type of the company, and having a clear sense of what the scenario looks like for each of the company will shape how strategies are done, and that we can have flexible strategies that will allow us to thrive in any of the possible outcomes of the future. So saying that, I will pass again the word to Ingolf, who will talk about the importance of strategic scenarios.
Yeah, thank you very much for presenting our methodology, and I hope the participants agree that this is a good approach to creating scenarios. And certainly, as I said earlier, we as a team really enjoyed following this methodology to create our 4 scenarios. So then, just to conclude this webinar, I want to reiterate the importance of undertaking this strategic scenario type analysis. So if you move on to the next slide. So with this scenario development exercise, we want to help energy companies in becoming more resilient in the face of uncertainty. Planning based on our scenarios allows companies to understand the right levers and uncertainties, to understand the system these variables create when they interact with each other, which Gabriela has shown nicely a few slides ago. We use this scenario-driven approach because of its flexibility. The ability to review and reevaluate possible outcomes is as important as understanding the right levers. By being prepared for different outcomes, companies can be way more resilient and make way better decisions. What we believe are the most important conclusions for energy companies from our scenarios, and what we want all of you listeners to take away from today's webinar, is that scenario-driven strategic analysis, planning, and decision-making is important for energy companies because the future is inherently unpredictable, and you really need to be able to navigate in a world where anything can happen. Change here really is the only constant. So everything is changing, everything is fluid, everything develops over time. You don't know what's going to happen, and therefore you want to prepare for this range of potential futures. And in that regard, understanding extremes is really important. They help you prepare for dramatic changes, even if some of these never become reality, but you at least go into one of direction. You understand, what if this happens? How can I prepare for something very extreme happening? In our view, companies should undertake scenario-driven strategic analysis, as it allows them to really put in place robust analytics following our approach. So you'll know which levers and uncertainties are more relevant, and that helps you identify the areas which you should closely monitor, which you should keep an eye on. It also helps you to signpost and understand, as we move through time, on which scenario trajectory are you. So you want to monitor what's happening in reality and then compare to the scenarios we've developed to see in which world are we moving into, which world are we moving into over time. And then you can embrace ambiguity in decision making. Because the world changes so fast, we don't always have all the information available, and we really need to get comfortable with this. Deep sector experience and, by extension, intuition are key in scenario planning. In addition, there's a need to constantly reevaluate your strategies to ensure flexibility, to give you this preparedness for all potential futures, or for all potential futures that you think are relevant to be analyzed for your business. And then thirdly, Build resilience into the strategy development process. Understanding that full spectrum of potential changes guides you towards being prepared to adapt to any situation that may occur. It helps you in making decisions under uncertainty. And especially, as I said earlier, energy companies who by nature are exposed to a broad range of external factors and who make decisions now that are important or that materialize in future, where you can only see 10 years, 20 years down the line, whether you've made the right or whether you've made the wrong decision. So having undertaken scenario-driven analysis enables energy companies to identify impactful mitigation actions and help you future-proof your business, at least to some degree. We at AFRY would be delighted to help you all in achieving this for your companies. So please get in touch, and please get in touch if you'd like to understand a bit more about our scenarios. And once you've read the brochure, whether you have any questions on kind of the more detailed scenario narratives. With that, I hand over to Andy for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ingolf and Gabriela. Very interesting. So we have had a few questions come through. I'm just going to paraphrase a couple of them, combine them where we've got similar questions. So first one, how do these scenarios that we've talked about today compare to AFRY's power price scenarios, well-known high central low scenarios?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, it's all about that funnel, right? And these four strategy scenarios are defined probably closer to the outsides or the extremes of the envelope of possible scenarios, with key scenario drivers being quite wide and cross-sectoral. If you then think about AFRY's three standard high, central, and low scenarios, they're more sector-specific and actually quite narrow. Our central scenario here is our best view of the future, while the high and the low scenario provide economic upside and downside cases around the central. And then it's worth bearing in mind that, as you've seen during this presentation, we've used 9 scenario levers to define our strategic scenarios, while our standard high, central, low scenarios, there's only 3 drivers: economic growth, technology costs, and decarbonization. So very close to the energy sector, while the strategic scenarios are much wider and take in different perspectives. So things that our core scenarios don't really look at, like things like migration and conflict and so on.
Good, thank you, Ingolf. And then there's a question here on the process. So how long, if we were doing this with a client, how long would we expect the process to last from start to finish? How many people might be involved? And how would we manage different viewpoints within that? And I know we had different viewpoints within our own analysis internally as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think in terms of the timeline for it, it really depends on the complexity and the number of scenarios, right? For these 4 scenarios, we've probably spent 2 to 4 months developing these, but not working on these full time. But what we've done is we've run a number of workshops involving very senior people from across our MCD energy team. And here the viewpoint was mostly from energy experts. So in terms of managing conflict, there wasn't too much conflict, because I think there's quite a high degree of agreement within the team in terms of how these energy sector drivers are going to develop. I think if we would have involved people from our bioindustry team, or if we would have involved people from other sectors, say, then there would have been more agreement. But usually, even when there's conflict, we can manage that by moderating the process and then coming to potentially branching out into different scenarios when there's huge agreement. So it just creates an opportunity for this conflict to have different angles, and we can define those different angles and different views of the future by working closely together with you.
Yeah. Thank you. And then maybe one final question. We'll finish at 2:45 as planned. So the scenarios we've described today are still fairly qualitative in nature. There's a question: do we have any plan? Or do we have any plans to model them quantitatively?
Yeah, right. As you say, they're purely qualitative at this stage. However, I think in future there is merit, there is a benefit from quantifying them, at least to some degree. And what we've thought about is to start forming a view on how the global energy mix or global energy demand may change over time in each of these scenarios. And then as we get more quantitative, that will probably filter down into, say, installed power sector capacities and potentially even further down the line. However, I think what we're not envisaging at this stage is to make them fully quantified, or even to kind of put them into our bit3 power market model and create power prices. So that's 1 or 2 steps too far. These are still going to be fairly qualitative views of the future with some degree of quantification, very similar to other scenarios that are kind of in the public domain.
Very good. Thank you. Well, thanks Ingolf for answering the questions. Thanks once again to both you and Gabriela for doing the presentation. There were more questions asked that we ran out of time for today. We will respond to people individually on those. So if you had a question and it didn't get answered, don't worry, we'll reach out and try and answer that. Also, please do reach out to us if there's anything you'd like to discuss, any questions that come up after the event. You can reach out to any one of the 3 of us. So that'd be fantastic. Just before we wrap up, if you can see the slide there, just a little advert for our next webinar, which will be looking at the utility scale battery supply chain, and looking at some of the challenges, solutions, opportunities in that. And that'll be on I think it should be Thursday, 25th of May, actually, not July. So we'll create the final pack. And it'll be at 12 UK time, 1 European time. So please do sign up to that. So just remains to say thank you once again. Thanks to everybody who joined, and the recording will be available for you when you're ready for it. Thank you. Goodbye.
Perfect. Thank you all very much for listening in. It's been a pleasure presenting to you.